Hello and welcome again to Cafetography.co.uk. Today we're taking a look at a very popular portrait and general purpose lens, the Canon 85mm f1.8 USM. This lens's slightly tight focal length of 85mm means that it can get you a strong emphasis on your subject, although 85mm is not so zoomed in that it can't also be used for other kinds of photography, like landscape shots. If you're shooting with an APS-C camera, the lens gives you an even more zoomed-in angle of view. But the main attraction of this lens is its bright f1.8 maximum aperture. This lens can let in a lot of light, and perhaps even better, it can give you a very out-of-focus background. It's also quite an affordable lens, so obviously it's of interest to even amateur photographers who want their photos to stand out from the crowd a little more. However, the lens does not have image stabilization, making it slightly tricky to use for video work. Filmmakers should definitely get their tripods out. This lens has great build quality. It's fairly compact, but it feels solid on your camera with a nice metal lens mount. The lens's focus ring is very smooth to use, although it doesn't turn very far, making precise manual focusing a tiny bit tricky. The lens has full-time manual focusing, so you can turn that focus ring anytime. The front lens element does not turn or extend as you change focus, which is good news for people who use certain kinds of filters. The autofocus motor is very quiet and extremely fast, as you can see here. All in all, the lens has fantastic build quality. Although it's fairly small and inexpensive, it handles very neatly. Let's look at image quality. We'll start by testing the lens on one of Canon's more expensive full-frame cameras, in this case a 20-megapixel Canon 6D. We'll turn on chromatic aberration and peripheral illumination correction for this test. With the aperture wide open at f1.8, the lens is very sharp in the middle of its images, delivering good contrast and a very clean picture. Over in the corners of the image, the lens is just a little softer, but it's still delivering great image quality. If we stop the lens down to f2.8, then the lens becomes even sharper and a little brighter in those corners, and at f4, the lens is razor sharp across the entire image frame. So, we're seeing a truly fantastic performance on a full-frame camera. Well, let's try it on a more common APS-C, or cropped sensor, camera. We'll use a 20-megapixel Canon 70D, and again, we'll turn on chromatic aberration correction and peripheral illumination for this test. Once again, the lens is very sharp indeed in the middle of the picture, straight from f1.8. Even when we look in the corners of the image, we see plenty of sharpness. For any lens at f1.8, this is a great achievement. Stop the aperture down a little more to f2.8 for absolutely perfectly sharp corners with no visible chromatic aberration. Image quality in the middle of the frame is also pretty fantastic. So there isn't much more to say really. The lens gives an astonishingly sharp performance when used on an APS-C camera. Let's take a look at vignetting and distortion levels. Vignetting and distortion are not really a problem for this lens when used on an APS-C camera, so we'll test it on a full-frame camera. As you can see, there is no noticeable distortion on this lens, which is pretty praiseworthy. However, the corners do look a little dark at f1.8, so we are seeing a bit of a vignetting issue. Stop the lens down to f2.8, however, and the corners brighten up very nicely indeed. Overall, it's a good performance for distortion and vignetting. A slight weakness of this lens is that it only has a minimum focus distance of 85 centimeters, which means it's not very useful for getting close-up photos of anything small. However, the close-up picture quality of this lens is very good, straight from f1.8, and stop the lens down to f2.8 for close-up picture quality that's very sharp indeed. One other slight weakness of this lens is that it doesn't like working against bright lights. When bright lights are in a picture, you lose a lot of contrast and get some rather strong flaring. you'll want to use a lens hood when shooting with this lens. As you can see from these pictures, the lens can give you a very out of focus background indeed. The good news is that it renders those out of focus backgrounds very nicely. The quality of this lens's bokeh is very smooth, which is especially great news for portrait photographers. Overall, this has been a very straightforward lens review for us to make, because the simple fact is that this lens delivers fantastic image quality in almost every respect. It's bitingly sharp, even when used at its fast maximum aperture of f1.8, and it produces gorgeous looking images, while managing to remain small-sized and relatively inexpensive. Its field of view might be a little bit tight on an APS-C camera, where the 85mm focal length is quite zoomed in, but that just makes it even better for portrait work. All in all, it's a masterful little camera lens, which comes very highly recommended.